Right. Okay, so we are picking up on Lamed Vav Amud Aleph, middle of the page, or Mama's middle of the page, Itmar. We completed the thought last week regarding carbonas, what carbon you would give, depending on whether you said an improper or lie that cost was a monetary loss or not, the carbon asham or carbon chatas. So the Gemara went through that, and again, it's not halacha l'maisa obviously right now, but there were carbonas attached to all of those kinds of incidents. So we came to the point where several people, I know Michael Horowitz, who was, I don't know if he's here, but he asked several questions, which leads us into this week's continuation. So we're in the middle where it says Itmar. So it says the Gemara, Itmar. And this is a very interesting continuation because we saw in the Mishnah that if someone rents a cow to someone else, then absent any instruction, that renter can turn around and lend the cow to someone else. In other words, there was no holdback for the renter to do what he wanted to do with the cow once he rented it from the owner. That was the Mishnah. Here, we're talking a little bit different. We're saying, shomer shemasal shomer. If I give an item to a shomer to watch, and he in turn turns it over to another shomer, and we're going to get into a minute what kind of shomer, but he turns over, for whatever reason, he's going to be preoccupied or whatever the thing is, and he turns it over to another shomer. So now, and he did this beli reshus, beli achrayus. In other words, he didn't ask for permission. He said, you know what, I'm not right now able to do this. I'm going to give it over to my friend Shimon, and he's going to go ahead and watch. So Rav Omer Potter, Rabbi Yochanan Omer Chayev. So as a blanket statement, Rav says that the first shomer, and here's where it gets a little interesting in terms of what we mean here. Rav Omer Potter, says Rashi, Mikol ma shehoya nifter in shamra hu atzmo. Rav is Potter from everything that he would be Potter if he were the shomer. So again, it's a little cryptic until we get into the actual terminology of what kind of shomer. But so Rav basically says that the first shomer did nothing wrong by turning it over to another shomer, and he's Potter from everything he would have been Potter anyway before. Rabbi Yochanan, however, disputes, and he says chayiv. What does he mean chayiv? Afilu ba'onsen. So it would seem that according to Rabbi Yochanan, if someone were a shomer chinam, we know that there are minimal restrictions. In other words, he's not chayiv for geneva, veda, and onsen or anything like that. And he turns it over to another shomer, and that shomer under his watch had an ones. Says Rabbi Yochanan that the first shomer, who would normally be potter from onsen, now is chayiv and onsen. So that's where the machlokes is. The machlokes is what responsibilities does the first shomer carry forward by transferring it to a second shomer? Okay. So now we're going to get into it, but that's basically the machlokes between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan. Okay. Now, Omar Abaya says Abaya. So now we're going to get a little bit more definition. L'tamei de Rav, according to Rav, who says Potter, lo meboyer shomer chinam shemosel l'shomer socha. There's no question that he's Potter. If he's a shomer, if I'm the shomer, I'm the original shomer. And I'm a shomer chinam, and I give it to you, Menashe, and you're a shomer socher, and we know that you as a shomer socher have greater responsibilities of chiyuv than I do. So there's no question that that's okay. The ale aleya l'shmiraso, because you've added a layer of shmira. In other words, the owner gave it to me to watch, and I'm a simple shomer chinam. I get no money, I get no benefits. So fine, I'm chayiv for pshia. Neva Veda? No. Now I turned it over to you, Menashe, and you're a shomer socher. You are getting paid, so you are going to get some money out of this. You have a higher standard. Your standard is Geneva Vaveda. Now, what happens if it's stolen? Then the owner can retrieve the value. So what have you done? You've been ma'alia. You have raised the level. So Rav says, who wouldn't agree to that? That's a no-brainer. That if you raise the level of shmira to someone who will be chayiv for more than what you're chayiv, that you're potter, you're out of it. So fine. Ela afilush, but he goes further. Ela afilush shomer socher shemasel shomer chinam, says Rav. But even if I'm a shomer socher and I'm chayiv for Geneva Aveda, and I give it to you, Menashe, and you're a shomer chinam, you get nothing. The Gurui Gora El Shmira, so where the Shmira level, we're not talking about the actual level. The level is what it is, but the upshot of what is going to happen is weakens it, meaning that if you're a shomer chinam and there's Geneva Aveda, then the owner cannot collect from you, not you, the second shomer. Still, says Rav Potter, the first shomer is absolved from any responsibility. My tama, doho masra ben das. So he introduces this concept, and he said, because I gave it to a ben das, meaning a competent, capable person. So we don't look at his designation, shomer chinam, shomer socher, whatever he is. We say, if I handed it off to a person who is capable, he's not an invalid, or he's not in any way not an appropriate person to do a watching, to do shmira, then Rav is very makel, and Rav says that the first guy can get out from under as long as he doesn't really step on a line. Memela, if he's giving it to a better shomer with greater responsibilities, there's no question that the balabos will want that, because all of a sudden he's covered on a greater number of events, right? Geneva, Aveda. But even if it's not, even if it goes from better to worse, according to Rav, as long as he gives it to a bandas, then it's okay.
All right, I got a question here.
Interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because it seems like I'm watching a lot of stuff here. So somebody else was a shomer socher, had this higher level of responsibility. He's got something else he's got to do. He comes over to me and says, "Hey, can you watch this?" And I'm not worried about getting paid. I got nothing else to do. Fine, no big deal. I'll watch it for an hour for you, no problem. And now I'm clearly not responsible for Geneva and Aveda, right? Because that's not the nature of what I'm doing. Fine. But shouldn't the person who, the middle guy, shouldn't he still be responsible? Because shouldn't, in a sense, he handed over responsibility for me, but shouldn't he be sort of globally, so to speak, be responsible still for Geneva and Aveda? In other words, somebody's got responsible. It doesn't go revert back to the original guy because he's still paying him.
Right. So that's the question. Yeah. And Rav's position is that the first person carries with him only the chiyuvim that he had when he was hired. If he was hired initially, then that's the chiyuv that he has.
Right.
However, if your question is, which the Gemara says, if he hands it off to a lesser responsibility, in other words, he's a shomer socher, and he hands it over to a shomer chinam. So Rav gives us a chiddush. Up till now, I would have said, you know what? He's chayiv for the shmira. He was chayiv when he was hired, which was a shomer socher. Right, you are right. Says the Gemara that Rav goes too far as to say that if, as long as he gives it to someone who's competent, regardless of what his stature is, shomer chinam, shomer socher, regardless of whether he's getting paid or not getting paid, he takes away the responsibility of the first shomer. In other words, the shomer is handing it off to someone and absolving himself of responsibility. That's how far Rav's heter is being
Right,
made.
but the thing is, the meantime, the owner paying this guy $50 a day to watch his Mercedes, okay?
Right.
And he's essentially treating it as this guy's gonna make sure it's clean. If it snows, he's gonna wipe it off, and he's gonna make sure he's gonna be responsible if it gets stolen or if it gets damaged, etc. And so the owner has gone ahead and done this, and yeah, he doesn't care if the guy delegates it to somebody else, but he still wants to be covered. He's still paying that $50 a day.
Right. And that's really the heart of the question. In other words, so your point is well taken. I mean, it's exactly what we would have expected there to be. So here, this touches on a machlokes rishonim on how you interpret what Rashi, what the Gemara is really saying. In other words, your question raises the question that turning it over to a competent individual, does that remove responsibility from the first shomer, or does it only add responsibility to the second shomer? That's
right.
That's
I would argue that it shifts responsibility,
shifts responsibility.
but it could only shift the responsibility that new shomer is capable of taking. And since that new shomer is unpaid and therefore not capable of taking Gneva and Aveda, therefore that responsibility should still lie with the first shomer.
Right. So that ambiguity, right. So that ambiguity is what the Rishonim, Rashi and others are grappling with, as to whether or not when we say he gives it to a Baal Das, whether or not that removes from him all liability. Some Rishonim say yes, and Rashi is among those who say no. In other words, according to Rashi, really, the giving it to the Baal Das initially puts the burden on the second shomer, but doesn't absolve the first shomer, as you point out. There are other Rishonim who say no. When he turns it over to a Baal Das who's fully capable, we don't look at what his stature is as far as what kind of shomer he is, responsible or not. The fact that he turned it over to him removes from shomer number one any responsibility, which l'chara you would question, because you would say, why, especially if it went down in stature, why would the owner ever agree that a shomer sachar who gives it to a shomer chinam and he hired the shomer sachar, that he should be potter? So that is the machlokes. You're absolutely right.
So if the middle guy is willing to pay to take this this cow off of his hands, to say, well, let's say he's got something else going on,
right,
that could be more remunerative financially, possibly. I was wondering about that. So he's paying to get rid of this responsibility, A, and B, who makes the assessment of Baal Das? Does he makes it unilaterally?
Yeah, I think Baal Das, we're using a sort of an objective label of someone who's got the capability of doing the rudimentary work that's necessary to be a shomer. He doesn't have to be a rocket scientist, but he's not handicapped.
Well, and presumably known to be a reasonably trustworthy person.
Yeah, trustworthy person who knows what he's doing, more or less. Yeah.
So he did some due diligence. He asked around about
He did some due diligence.
All right, okay.
Right. But the question that Menashe is asking is valid, and that's really the source of the machlokes rishonim as to whether or not. Now, for instance, lahavdil, when we write contracts, and for instance, you rent a property from me, and you're working the property, and I come to you and I said, I have found I want to leave town, I want to give up this business, but I have someone who I want to substitute to take over the property, and you know what? He's got deeper pockets than me. If something happens, you're going to get a much better result from him than from me. Then the owner, as it were, has to be the one to say, you know what? I will allow you to let him be the primary, but I'm not letting you off the hook. In other words, if something happens, I want to make sure because I dealt with you that I'm covered. Even though on paper it seems like he's a more perfect fit, I don't want to give up. On the other hand, there are those, I've seen many contracts where that is the case, that's given that you're giving him a better security than what you have with me. He's allowing me, maybe it's a small fee, maybe not, to walk away, so I no longer have any liability. So that's really the question here, is whether or not the original owner, who never sanctioned the transfer, and ultimately, is he going to be a winner or a loser? In other words, is his position? He wants his position to be no worse than it was before. Better maybe, but certainly no worse. So we're saying here that if you give it to a higher level of shmira, meaning a shomer chinam to a sacher who has greater level, then the underlying principle is that a shomer sacher has a higher degree of responsibility. He'll be even more careful because he knows that he has a higher degree of responsibility. That is something that an owner would want. But on the other hand, what happens if all else failed and that second person absconds? Let's say because the original owner doesn't know who the second guy is, he knows the first guy. So the first guy, he has a certain sense of reliability that this is a guy I'm willing to let be my shomer, because I know if there's a problem, I'll get reimbursed. Second guy, I don't know. So maybe he never really relinquished the first guy's responsibility. So that is the machlokes b'shainim. But Rav's position on the surface is he is quite makel, and he's saying that if you give it to a bar das, you yourself are ultimately not responsible. Again, the machlokes b'shainim in Rav is what we're really dealing with. But when you look at it on paper, Rav is the one who says that the first guy is absolved. Now let's look at Rashi. And there's no question that the first guy is potter from ones, the ein loch loma pishiahi shemasra la'acher. And you can't even say, oh, he was careless in giving it to the guy. In other words, not careless in the act, but careless in finding a substitute. You can't say that because he gave it to a bardas. He gave it to someone who, on the surface, is a normal guy who would carry forward. So he is potter. That's Rav's interpretation. Now let's take a look at Rabbi Yochanan. Well, the Talmid Rabbi Yochanan is the one who said it's chayiv lo meboyer shomer sacher shemasa l'shomer chinam. There's no question that a shomer sacher, the original shomer was a shomer sacher, and he gave it to a shomer chinam, the grua gara l'shmiraso, that he weakened the shmira, and therefore he's chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan said you're chayiv because you took me from a shomer sacher to a shomer chinam. Ela afila shomer chinam shemasa l'shomer sacher. But even if it went the other way, I hired you as a shomer chinam. You gave it to a shomer sacher. You raised the level of responsibility. The oli alay l'shmiraso, that you raised the level of shmira. Chayiv, the first guy is chayiv, still chayiv. Why? He has a different theory. The amalei ein ritzoni pikdoni biyad acher. I don't want my pikadon in the hand of a third person. Very simply, I trust you. I know you. You're from my neighborhood. I've had a long history with you. You want to give it to someone, even though he's a shomer sacher, and on paper he's a better fit for me because he's got greater level of responsibility. But I don't know him. I have no comfort level. How many times do we do things on our gut reaction that we give it to someone we know because that person has a history and we trust it? But someone, just because he's a shomer sacher and he has greater spread for achrayus, isn't enough for Rabbi Yochanan. Yeah, Menashe.
So in that case, though, if then the first shomer is, if he says that the first shomer is the one who is liable, has to pay the owner, but that first shomer should then be able to collect from the second shomer.
That may be fine and good, and we're not getting into that aspect of it, of whether or not there is claims from shomer 1 to shomer 2.
Right.
And you're right. In the real world, maybe those things exist. We're trying to understand in the machlokes between of Rav and Rabbi Yochanan what are the responsibilities of that first shomer to the owner? So we're focused just on that aspect of the case, but you're right.
Right. I mean, it's an important thing because
it's an important thing.
The Baals should get paid back whether or not that second shomer pays up.
Absolutely.
And that's the point.
Absolutely. But in the greater scheme of this machlekes, we're solely focused on shomer number one and the owner, and what responsibilities he has or doesn't have once he hands it off to shomer number two. Okay, so that's basically how we define the machlekes, and keep in mind that in the machlekes there's also a secondary machlekes of Rishonim, whether or not it truly means that the responsibility of shomer number one is completely wiped out because he gives it to number two, or whether there is some trailing responsibility that shomer number one has, notwithstanding. But okay, and that's the separate machlekes which we've quoted. But as far as Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, Rav pretty much is a mekel, and Rabbi Yochanan is a machmir. Okay. So now, having said all this, so now we have a sort of a sense of the machlekes. Now we're going to try to understand. Okay, so where does Rav get his substance? In other words, what's Rav coming from? Where's he coming from? What's his reliance? Amar Rav Chizda, says Rav Chizda, Hod Rav, this whole concept of Petur, of Rav, Lav beferish itma. We don't know it from something that Rav said, standing in a shiur and a stender and clapping on the stender and saying, you know, when he gave a psach halacha or he gave a shiur, he said these words. That didn't happen. So how do we know it? Ela mechlala, we know it mechlal. In other words, we know it sort of as a general matter. The Hana Gina, so from the following interesting episode, which we'll dig out of that episode where Rav stands. The Hana Gina, the Chol Yoma have a mafke mare gabedehu savta. There were these gardeners who did gardening, and every day after work they turned in their gardening utensils to this woman who basically was a shomer, right? She was a shomer. Now we don't know at this point, but she was a shomer, and that's who they turned it into. Yoim echad, one day, afkedinu legabe chad v'nei. Whether they didn't have the time, they were rushing. Instead of turning it over to the woman, they gave it to one of the gardeners. In other words, let's say there were 5 gardeners, and all 5 pool their stuff together and say, hey, Shimon, you're going to be designated today. We can't find the lady. You go ahead and hold our utensils. So what happened here? They switched automatically without consultation. They gave it to one of the gardeners. Shoma kol behalula. This Shimon heard, as he was walking home with all of these gardening utensils, he heard merriment, he heard dancing, a chasana or simcha was going on. And naturally, he quickly ran to the home of the woman, and he said, "Here, Mrs., is all of the utensils that for the day, and I'm going to the simcha." Guess what? So does this sound familiar? So this sounds like they made him a shomer, probably a shomer chinam, but probably didn't pay him, and he turned it over to the lady. Now we don't know if this woman was habitually a shomer chinam or shomer sacher, but clearly it was shomer mosel the shomer. It was one shomer who gave it to the other shomer, even though the second shomer was the normal shomer. But in this case, she wasn't, because they gave it to the first guy. Okay. Now, as luck would have it, they were stolen. The items were stolen, and the question is, who's responsible? Who's the shomer? Who's the responsible party? Also, the Kamei de Rav, of course, they came to Rav, Upotra, and he said Potter. You wouldn't expect anything less because Rav is saying that Shomer Shalamasal Shomer, as long as the second Shomer is competent, which she is, because she is the regular Shomeres, she's the regular person, then Potter, because that's Hishita. Hishita is Shomer Shalamasal Shomer, as long as she's competent, Potter. So man the Chaza Savar, so there were Talmidim or others who were there when this happened. So man the Chaza Savar Mishum Shomer Shemosel Shomer Potter. So the Talmidim saw this and they said, "Oh, Shomer Shemosel Shomer is Potter. That's Rav Shita." So they announced to the world again. This is how it came out. It didn't come out from Rav. It came out from his actions in this particular event. And the Talmidim basically said, oh, Rav says it's Potter. So we see that Shomer Shemosel Shomer is Potter. Okay, that's the events that the Gemara is telling us led to Rav's announcement. Okay, period. Frank the Gemara Velohi. Why? Why do you extrapolate from this case that Shomer Shemosel Shomer is Potter? We're talking about something different. Shani Hossam, the Kol Yomanami inu Gufa Gabedihu Safta have a mafkele. You know why this case is what it is? It's because the end result is what was the norm. In other words, this was a case where the woman is usually the repository and successful repository of the utensils all the time. We have no kasha on that. What happened here was that there was a step along the way. It didn't go directly from the gardeners to the woman. It went from the gardeners to one of their own to the woman. But how do you extrapolate from that in a sort of a regular case, a case that has nothing to do with the connection between the people who are giving the item and the shomer? How do you know in such a case that would be acceptable? Maybe Rav wouldn't accept that. So they're asking a kasha on the fundamental halacha or the fundamental principle that Rav says, Potter, how can you take from this case that it's Potter? We don't know that. We know from our learning that unless something is totally on all fours, meaning it is so identical to what we're talking about that there's no wiggle room to say it's different. Then we say, okay, he can learn it from this because this is an identical case to our case. You can't make there's no light, as they say, there's no air, there's no light between us. But here, it's a totally different case. It's a case where the end shomer wound up being the normal shomer, and so we understand Rav's position. But who says Rav would agree in a case where you turned it over to a shomer that nobody knew beforehand, or certainly there was no comfort level on the part of the owner beforehand because he didn't know who it was. So that's the kasha the Gemara asks here on the very source of Rav's acknowledgement, his halacha. They ask that kasha. The Gemara doesn't really answer it, but so we're left with the question. But the principle that we're applying here is that Rav, who is Mako, he's very Mako, and the question is he Mako because the incident for which his whole halacha came to light was where there was a fundamental understanding who was getting it or not. So we can debate that. I mean, the Gemara doesn't debate it. The Gemara just leaves it as a kasha, but we can debate it or just say, you know what, this is an interesting aspect because we don't know because Rav never announced it. It came about as a result of the incident that his Talmidim saw, and they said, you know what, this is Rav Shita. And the Gemara is trying to distinguish Rav Shita and saying, no, it's not quite that, because here we have a little bit of a twist, an anomaly, that the end result was what he would have done anyway. So we don't know the answer. I'm looking at Rashi. So Rashi says, Man b'choza echem min ha-talmidim sheshoma mipiv the patre sover shomer shemosel l'shomer, and then have a mifkedei law. The lo motza omale ein ritzono shir biyada. You can't say that he would have objected to being in her hands because that's normally what happens. It's in her hands. So that is a non-starter when you want to say, oh, we're going to distinguish it because of that. Okay. So, okay, we're going to leave that. We're going to leave that, and we're not going to necessarily define whether or not it's a fallacy to say that that's Rav Shita, because it is a Shita. And here we're going to leave that that's the source. So now
Rabbi, it's
Yeah.
not that unusual for them to try to draw inferences from a decision that a judge made. I mean, we've had like Rav Nachman ruled such and such a case, and therefore they infer his position is that Rav Huna, something came before Rav Huna and he ruled this way, and they try to draw an inference to a slightly different instance from that to get his legal positions. So it's not that unusual to what they're doing with Rav.
right. So what side of the argument are you taking?
I'm just saying it's not unusual
that it is a fallacy, or it's not a
no,
fallacy.
it's not a fallacy to say Rav ruled this way in such and such a case. Therefore, this is probably his legal position.
Right.
We've done that. We've had that before with Rav Huna and Rav Nachman and
Right. Even though we can make some chiluk in the Shani Hossam. I agree. In other words, the Shani Hossam isn't a death knell to Rav's position. The Gemara is only trying to say, wait a minute, since Rav didn't say it in so many words, and you Talmidim want to extrapolate, there's something that might hinder your being able to fully hang this on Rav. Right. That's really what's happening. But you're right that oftentimes does not make a change in the ultimate psak. Okay.
I think maybe what is unusual is that this survived the period of Tanaim without being disputed. It came down all the way to Rav before somebody disagreed or had said or would have conflicting positions. Isn't this something? I mean, we've had the issue of like akin to subcontracting that's come up in other instances. It's unusual that this would not have been taken up earlier.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, yes, that's something to consider. But okay, so we're going to leave it here, and we're going to say that is Rav's source, and we're going to hold like it. And this is Rav's position. Now, Yosef Rav Ami v'kamalo lahayshmatza. So Rav Ami repeated this incident. Esvei Rav Ava bar Mamel Rav Ami. So Rav Ava bar Mamel asked of Rav Ami, "Hasoicher para mechavero." Our Mishnah, Hasoicher para mechavero hishila la'acher u'meisa kedarka, which absolves everybody. Yishova hasoicher shemeisa kedarka. The soicher has to swear. V'hashoa mishalem l'soicher. That's our Mishnah. It's exactly our Mishnah. Then Isa. Okay, the Im Isa. Now, what did we say in Rabbi Yochanan? If we go back, we said in Rabbi Yochanan that the Rabbi Yochanan's teretz, why Rabbi Yochanan does not absolve this fellow, even though he may have given it to a higher level of shmirah, is because he doesn't want it to be in the hands of that particular person. He doesn't know him. He has no confidence, whatever you want to say. Okay, so now, Frek the Gemara on the Mishnah, Vim Isa, so why are you saying that in the case of the Mishnah, the original owner we said is out of luck? Because remember, I started off reviewing that when he gave it to the Seicher, there were no restrictions. The Seicher could do whatever he wants with it. The Seicher then gave it to a Shoel. The Seicher didn't necessarily benefit because he's paying rent, and he gave it to a borrower who didn't give him any money. So it wasn't as if he was getting, let's say, wealthy on the other guy's item. He basically took the para, gave it to the Shoel, and the Shoel borrowed it. Now, the Shoel is the one in his possession, it died. So we're saying, what does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says that Sofer makes a shvuah, he's absolved from paying the owner, but the Shoel has responsibilities to the Sofer. So the Gemara, wait a minute, V'im Isa, if it's true, according to Rabbi Yochanan, why doesn't the owner say, I never agreed to have my pikadon in someone else's hand. Therefore, whatever you did improperly. And what does he really say? He's really saying is, so you, Seicher, are a middleman without any clout. Move out of the way. Let me deal with the shoyel, and let the shoyel pay me. Why do you have a windfall and get money and I get nothing? Let me go to the shoyel. Let me get paid. And you will be that extraneous shomer who is off on the side. Because that's Rabbi Yochanan Shita. Rabbi Yochanan Shita is that the second shomer really has no, that shomer is really kind of hanging out there. So let him say, fine, move away. You have nothing to do with this anymore. I never acknowledged that it should go to the third person. So that's the kasha. So Rav Abba Bar Mamo asked Ravami, and he says, according to you, that the transaction is acceptable to go from one to the other. Why is it acceptable? So the Gemara now has to reconcile Rabbi Yochanan as to why Rabbi Yochanan says it's okay. Omalei of Mayaskinan bishenosna lo rishus habalin lahashem. You know what? I'm going to interject a fact, and the fact here is that the Baal did give, the original owner gave permission in our Mishnah for the Soicher to give it to the Shoyel. That changes everything. Once he gives permission, then the chain that goes from the owner to the Soicher is broken. So who's the real balabos here? The Soicher, because he was given permission to rent it. So the owner cannot now come back and absolve or push away the Soicher and say, Soicher, you get out of the way, let me deal, because he gave him the permission to do it. Okay, so that's the Gemara's teretz. We don't know that when we learned the Mishnah, but we're learning it now, that's the teretz he gave him, Mishus Abalim. Frech, the Gemara, okay, so it's a valid answer, we understand it, and he has no taina on him at all, right? He has no taina. So now, Rishus Abalim. Frech, the Gemara, Yehocha, Labalin boy Lashlume. In other words, why then can't the owner come back and say that I had an intent? Okay, I gave you permission, but let's see, Rashi, 1 minute. So in other words, even though he gave him permission, the argument should be that the balabos, the original owner, was the one who lent it to him. He gave him permission, but he was the lender. Lamaisa, he was the one who lent it to the shoyel. Why doesn't he get the benefits of the payment? So in other words, what is the reshus? How does that interrupt the chain between the original owner and the lender? So the Gemara says, here's the key. He said l'datoch. Now he didn't say go lend it. He said, do what you want. If you're of a mind to lend it, lend it. If not, not. So that word becomes critical because that word l'datoch breaks the chain from the original owner to the soicher, and now the soicher can lend or not lend. If he doesn't lend, there's no taina. If he lends, there's no taina because he gave him a broad brush responsibility. So the Gemara is teaching us that even though the owner gave him reshus, he didn't tell him to lend. And that's the distinction. If he would have told him to lend, then there would have been a clear chain of owner telling the Seicher to lend, the Seicher lends. Now the owner comes back and says, I told you to lend. No problem. I'm the lender. The Shoyl is the end guy. You're nothing. You're in the middle. But since he said to him, Rishus, I give you Rishus. Rishus means don't do it. Rishus means you want to do it, do it. You don't want to do it, don't do it. That's Pshat Rishus. So because he said Rishus, he himself takes himself out of the mix, and now the Seicher can do nothing, or he can give it to the Shoyl. He gives it to the Shoyl. There happens to be an accident. The Shoyl now has to pay, and the person he pays to is to the Seicher who had the discretion. That's the key word. He had the discretion to lend, not to lend. And meantime, the owner is unfortunately out of the picture. So that's how the Gemara wants to describe Rabbi Yochanan and say that that's why Rabbi Yochanan has no taina, even though he takes a very strict view of it. He basically absolves himself from any recovery by using these words, and that's how the Gemara posits it. So therefore, he has no connection at all. Take a look. Rashi says, it should go to the Baalim. Your will. If you want to give it to the borrower during the days that you're renting from me, I'm not makbid. I don't care. Do it. The Baalim can't come back and say, no, I never agreed, because they basically put it all in the hands of the Seicher. And so what we're saying here, the Chiddush, is that it changed Rishus from the Baalim to the Seicher because of these words. Words matter. He gave him L'datcha, so he took himself totally out of the picture as to whether or not he has a claim going forward. If he hadn't said that, then the he would have still been in the chain, and he would have a right taina to say, Seicher, step out of the way, let me deal with the Shoyl, which you would have thought would have been the case, because Rabbi Yochanan is machmer. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who's machmer and says that, no, I'm not absolving. Why don't? So then if you're not absolving, then you should have rights here. Teretz says you don't have rights because you basically gave those rights away to the Seicher. That's what the Gemara says, and that's what Rashi is trying to amplify. Okay, so now we kind of have a little bit more definition on Rav and on Rabbi Yochanan of their respective positions, why Rav says Potter and why Rabbi Yochanan says Chayiv. Now, so let's go a little weiter. Again, one leads to the other. Mosav Rami Bar Chama. So Rami Bar Chama asks a kasha, Amafkid Mors Eitzel Chaveiro. If someone gives money to his friend, in other words, he gives it to him basically to hold, but it's not. It doesn't say he's a shomer of any kind. He gives it him to hold. Shrorim v'hiv shilin la'afrov. So he ties the money up and he slings it on his back, or Masrun Lebno Lebito Hakatanim, or he gives it to his children, his son or daughter who are Katanim, which means what? So that they are not Bachiyuva. Earlier we said that you hand it over to someone who is responsible. This is not a case where he gave it to someone responsible, right? Or V'nol b'fneim shelo karoi, or he basically turned it over to them, and it wasn't properly secured. In other words, he may have put it in a lockbox that didn't have a lock, or maybe he left them in the apartment without locking the door. But basically, it was unsecured. So all these three are cases of potential pshia. potential carelessness. So says the Gemara. So Rabbi Chama says chayiv. Why? Shaloshama kederach hashomer. Because he didn't watch it the way a normal person watches it. A normal person is not careless. A normal person secures the pikadon and makes sure that at least as much as he possibly can, he secures it so that someone shouldn't be able to get it. Now, someone can break in or whatever, but in the normal course, if you secure it, we're saying that's sufficient. So, okay, so he didn't do that. Says the Gemara, Tamo the Ketanim. The reason why one of the examples he gave it to Ketanim, and we said earlier that Ketanim are not, we say they're not Bachayuva. So he didn't give it to a Bardas. Remember the words Bardas? Bardas basically means a gadol, someone who is reliable. And we say that so you have to be a gadol for that. Okay. So he gave it to a cotton. So the reason why he's chayiv is because he gave it to a cotton. Hagadolim potter. But if he had given it to a gadol, not a cotton, then he would be potter. He would not be responsible. Amai. Why? We have just now introduced a concept in Rabbi Yochanan that he can say, you know what? I don't like this guy. I don't want it to be in his hands. You can't put it in someone's hands that I wouldn't want. Maybe for some reason he has bad luck. He's known to be a person who has two left hands, two left feet, and so he makes mistakes. So why should I entrust it in his hands? So the kasha is, if you're going to extrapolate and say that a cotton, no, but a gadol, yes. Why a gadol, yes, when you can, according to Rabbi Yochanan, fall back on the principle of ein ritzona she'ipikdona b'yad acher. Okay, so that's the kasha. That's the kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. Now that we have sort of established Rabbi Yochanan's position, we're going one step further. And we're saying, what's he going to do with that particular brisa where it says you can't give it to a cotton, but we say you can give it to a gadol? Why should you be able to give it to a gadol? There's still the problem of ein ritzona. So says the Gemara, Omar Rava, comes Rava, and he says, Kol hamafki avas ishto ubanav umafki. So Rava gives us a different interpretation, and Rava says, and we look at Rashi, Aldas Ishto Ubanav, Aldas Shahanifgad Mosrol Ishto Ubanav Hagadolim, Ben Yecholam Loma Ein Ritzonenu. So, in other words, Rava is saying that when a person gives it over, anytime a person gives, I give you, say, David, I give you a pikadon to hold for me, inherent in that giving is that you can give it to your wife and children who are gedolim, and that's acceptable. In other words, that form of transference is understood by everybody to be acceptable. That's what Rava is saying. So he's enlarging the scope of Rabbi Yochanan, and he's saying, no, you don't have to get specific reshus. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan cannot come back and say, I don't like it to be in that person's hands, because the principle is kolam mafki. Anybody who gives to his wife or children, it's hainohach, it's like him. Okay, so that's a different concept, and we accept the concept. Amr Nadoi, and so the Nadoi, who we've heard before, were the predominant sort of group that was learning halacha. We saw that from other gemaras. Dekanami, I'll give you a raya that yes, the high digdol and patur and dafka beno cotton lo dafka bonav nokat lo chayrim, says Rashi, that when he says gdolim mapoter, it's only for his children, not for acherim. Listen to this. The principle of gedolim, says Rava, refers to gedolim of your children, not to gedolim of strangers. That's what Rashi's saying. Dekanami, I'll bring you a raya, the high the gedolim peturin. the reason why Gedolim are Peturin, Dafka Bonov Nokat, below Acherim. He didn't say in his when we quoted Rava, he didn't say he said Masum Livno Ubito Hakatanim. He gave it to his son or his daughter, the Katanim. He didn't say Masra the Katanim, meaning everybody's cotton. It meant your child cotton. So your child cotton is no good, but your child gadol is good. But what about someone else's child gadol? So comes the Nerdoi and says, Dekenami diktani, o shemasum lo bito haktanim chayv, olav no levito hagdolim potter, mechlal de la acherim, lo shno gdolim, velo shno ktanim chayv. So Nerdoi is extrapolating that because of that, the wording of that brisa, it means only your own child gadol, but not someone else's child gadol. The imkain, because if that's not the case, listen to Ketanim Stama. Let him just say Ketanim Stama, and we would know that a cotton is no good, but anybody's gadol, your cousin's gadol, your brother's gadol, my gadol, they're all good. Teretz is, he says, Levno Levito, so he's excluding that only your own child, but not someone else. Shema Mino. Okay, so he's taking Rava's words and he's endorsing them, but he's narrowing the scope and saying that from that brisa. Now notice he only picks the middle one. He doesn't pick the other ones because that's the one that has the most ambiguity, I guess, because he says Levno Levita. So we've established from here that he really can say but it can that doesn't apply to your own children, but it can apply to a gadol of your brother, your cousin, your uncle, or your friend. So that's the chiddush that he wants to tell us. Shema Mino. Omar Rava. Now we're going to get to the end here. Omar Rava. Hilchasa shomer shemasol l'shomer chayiv. The halacha is that shomer shemasol l'shomer is chayiv, right? That you're chayiv. Lo meboyer shomer sacher. Now, what does that mean? Chayiv. Lo meboyer shomer sacher shemasol l'shomer chinam. No question that if you go downward, degrui gorelish mirasa, you went from a shomer sacher to shomer chinam, then everybody would say you're chayiv because you've weakened the shmira, and therefore the original owner has less to rely on because now he's relying on the shomer chinam instead of a shomer sacher. But even remember in Rabbi Yochanan now, even a shomer chinam shemasol l'shomer sacher, where you've raised the level of shmira so that you now have a greater degree of coverage than you had before, still chayiv. My tama, the omale at mehemes li b'shvua, heich lo mehemen li b'shvua. So he comes to the same conclusion, but he gives a slightly different teretz. Our teretz up to now in Rabbi Yochanan is that he basically said that ein ritzona sheyipikdoni b'yad. I don't want my pikadon in someone's hands, even if his level of shmira is greater than yours, and it would seem that he would be more responsible to me. Still, I don't want it. But now, he's saying, according to Rabbi Yochanan, this is the halacha. Shama masol l'shomer chayiv. But you know why you're chayiv? Not because I don't like the other guy. You, I believe, with a shvua, right? Because you're going to make a shvua here, and I trust your shvua, but I don't trust someone else's shvua. What's going to happen is that the second guy is going to have to swear, and I don't trust his shvua. So it's slightly different than the principle of ein ritzona sheyipikdoni b'yad acher, which is more okay. I don't like my stuff being in someone else's hands. I gave it to you. I trust you. Now we're going even further. And we're saying it's not just a question of I like you better, therefore I have more comfort with you, but it has to do with shvuas. So so Rashi says B'shvua shelo poshabo. In other words, the shvua that you were not careless, for some reason, he may believe that that person's shvua isn't 100% kosher. In other words, he feels that maybe with that shvua, he doesn't get everything that he gets. So he has the right to say, you know what, you can't just turn it over to someone else, even though that other person was going to make a shvua, which is more than just, I don't like him. And therefore, his position remains what it is. So we're left with the machlokes Rav and Shmuel, and Rava comes along and says the halacha is like not Rav and Rabbi Hyatt, I'm sorry, and Rava comes along and says that the halacha is like Rabbi Yochanan, that we take a more stringent view, even where the shmira is going to be better than it was before, because we're sensitive to the owner's own feelings, and since he did it shalom rishus, then there, not like the Mishnah, where even though he didn't say anything, he basically gave the Seifer carte blanche to do what he wants. Shomer, Shemosul Shomer isn't carte blanche. It has to be with either rishus, or there has to be some acknowledgement that he can do that. It's not totally hefker. So therefore, he says to him, okay, now you're chayiv to me, and I'm not going to let you off the hook just because you gave it to someone who has a higher degree of shmir. Now, in an objective sort of way, the first shomer isn't necessarily it's not all bad for him, because he is chayiv to the owner. That's what the upshot of Rava is. But now, wait a minute. Does he have any rights vis-a-vis the other shomer? And that's just a general question. If he now has to pay the owner because he didn't have the right to transfer it, we can still clear. This is not the Gemara's clear. We can still clear is not all lost to him, because he can go to Bezdin perhaps and say, Bezdin, I gave it to a Shema Sacha. There was a Geneva Aveda. There was whatever it was. I should be able to collect. So that's a separate question outside of this, as to whether or not the power of the owners not allowing him to do it basically takes him out of the parsha that he can't collect. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, we know that the first shomer is now, according to Rabbi Yochanan, definitely chayiv, because he was careless, he shouldn't have done it. It was shalom rishus, got it. The question that lingers, I wonder, is if the shomer himself turns to the second shomer and says, I gave it to you as a shomer sacha, and there was a Geneva Aveda, you should at least have to pay me the value, because you were responsible for Geneva Aveda, not to the original owner. The original owner has been compensated by me, but whether or not you have an achrayus to me is, I'm just clearing the shaila as to whether or not that there is a continuum, or because he is basically he's absolved, because the first person has to pay the owner, and the second guy is totally off the hook because there's no achrayus. That's the question. I'm just questioning that. Something I would look into, but the Gemara doesn't address it. The Gemara says that the first owner can completely wipe out the that chain by saying lo mehemen le b'shvua, I don't believe in the shvua. So we have two terutzim. One, which is the original teretz, is that he says ein ritzona sheyeh pikdoni b'yad acher, and this one, which is a little bit stronger, and he says I don't believe him with a shvua. So you can't make me believe him with a shvua, and therefore you're chayiv. Rashi ends it. Ani omer sheyeshna b'yado. Which Rashi? B'shvua shelo poshabo, that he makes a shvua that he wasn't careless. Okay, so we finished. Yeah.
That consciousness of that shvua was very, very powerful in that society. I mean, like, it's totally meaningless in the secular civil society today, but just the consciousness of the shvua, whether it was going to be resorted to or not, was very powerful to them.
As we've said all along, that no one took shvuas lightly, and therefore, when it comes to a shvua, you do everything you can to get out of it. But if you're mechuyev to make a shvua, then it would certainly give the owner the rights to say, I don't trust the shvua. In other words, you're right. The shvua is such a powerful tool, and in the hands of the original owner, he can say, I just don't accept it. I don't believe he's going to be honest. I think he's not going to be truthful.
Well, I mean, that would mean that some people would take it lightly. In other words, they wouldn't believe their shavuos. So some people obviously did take it lightly, but the overall impression of that in the society was much more powerful and valid than you would think about today.
Yes, absolutely.
It was viewed as a truth serum, basically. I mean, wasn't it?
Yes, it was something that people feared. Why? Because you used God's name. In a shvua, you have to swear with God's name. Even the more cavalier seem to take that a little bit more seriously. If you've got to invoke God, you know what? Leave God out of this. I don't really want to make a shvua here. And remember that some shvuas are mandatory in almost every case. We said before that in the case of a shomer, even if he's totally absolved, he has to make a shvua that he himself didn't convert it for his own use because he liked it and therefore he took it. So he has to make a threshold shvua. It's not in my possession. I didn't. I'm willing to pay you for it. I'm willing to pay you the value, but I kind of liked it, so I took it for myself, and now I'm going to pay you. He has to make that shvua, and that shvua is almost in every case non-waivable. So you got to be careful because some shvuas you can say I'd rather pay. Okay, I understand that, but when it comes to that particular shvua of a shomer, you can't waive it because he's got to actually swear I didn't convert it for myself, and now I'm willing to pay you. So,
but we haven't even today. I mean, it's sort of, I think to some degree fallen by the wayside because of all sorts of cases saying you can't make somebody, you can't separate religion. But the concept certainly in American society of swearing in a court, swearing on a Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. It's the same, similar concept, not exactly the same.
Right,
similar.
right. But today we give some of the option to affirm rather than to swear, whether or not, in other words, you're not really swearing using God's name. So does that make it less onerous because you're affirming as opposed to swearing?
Right, but the concept is there. That
the concept is there, right? The concept is there. So okay, so we reached the end of the sugya. Mitzvah Shem will pick up next week is Tisha B'Av.
Right.
I will not be here the following week. So the next year Mitzvah Shem will be, I guess, in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, we'll.
Okay.
Right. Next week, no. The following week, I won't be here. And the following week, Mitzvah will pick up from Lamed Vav on the days right over here.
Enjoy your vacation.
Everybody.